This is the Chapter 12 Extra Credit Test Review, and you can just look at this video. I'm going to go down each of these questions one by one, say what I think about them. You can jot down what you think is important and turn this in for extra credit. And as you can see, this doesn't have nearly everything that we've learned from Chapter 12 in it. We've really had to kind of focus and narrow down what we want to test and what we don't, because we've learned so much. And that would be just an incredible amount to study. So you can use this guide to kind of make your efforts more efficient and really hone in on what's going to be on the test. So why is the Renaissance an apt name for what began in Italy around 1400? Keep in mind that the Renaissance was an endeavor to learn from the classics to create not only a new society, not only a new system of education, but an entire new historical era. So in that sense, the Renaissance was very, very ambitious. And that's why you can call it a rebirth. It's a whole new era. And what important factors made Italy an ideal place for the Renaissance to begin? And you can chalk that up to things like geography, economics, social environment, political environment. For example, with the geography, they were stuck out in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, so it gave them access to ports all over the Mediterranean. Economic, you're talking about a place where there's a lot of wealth, a lot of trade, a lot of commerce, a lot of industry, particularly the woolen cloth industry in Florence. Keep that in mind. There's banking, there's money to invest in art, there's culture, and there's learning. And all of those have an economic base to them that the rest of Europe doesn't really have at this time. There are social reasons. For example, northern Italy was highly urbanized. It was an urbanized environment with lots of classical ruins everywhere to remind people of where their society had been at one time. And there are political reasons. Italy was not a unified country, wasn't going to be a unified country for hundreds of years. There was no sense of loyalty to a nation of Italy. That didn't exist in the minds of anyone. Instead, you had independent city-states called communes that made up the political composition of the peninsula, and the wealthy guilds provided a lot of that leadership as well. So let's go to Petrarch. What was Petrarch's contribution to the Renaissance? Without Petrarch, you've got no Renaissance. Petrarch, as we know, is known as the father of humanism, and his love for good Latin led him to rediscover and revive classical Roman texts. And his dissatisfaction with the medieval scholastic educational system led him to use his love of the classics to inspire a whole new educational system called humanism. A lot of times in our 21st century, we'll call it the humanities, same word. And it was broader, it was more practical, it was more flexible, and the three pillars of humanism were there. You had secularism, you had the classics, and you had eloquence and precision of expression. What was the significance of the patronage system? Patronage was how so much Renaissance art was financed. Patrons could be princes, they could be church leaders, they could be wealthy business people, they could even be state governments. And a wider variety of patrons than just the church led to a wider variety of subjects, styles, and techniques. What motivated these secular patrons to pay for art? Well, for one thing, art was considered a safe investment. It was a solid investment of your money. Many of these patrons had come into a lot of money after the Black Death, but the other reason they did it was, of course, to enhance their prestige. And this particular motive applied to both secular patrons like princes and merchants and governments, as well as clerical patrons like popes and churches. So what was unique about Florence? Wool, and of course, banking. These two things made Florence a wealthy commercial and industrial and financial center. So what were some Renaissance values expressed in Renaissance art? And really, it's the pillars of humanism. It's all about the humanism. Number one, eloquence and precision of expression. and that was expressed through a fascination for naturalism, including linear or geometric perspective to achieve a sense of depth and distance in these paintings, the correct anatomy and portraiture, capturing somebody's face and what they look like so that if you saw them on the street, you could recognize them. There was also secularism, classical subjects, as well as religious subjects, as well as daily life could all be depicted in art. And there was a wider variety of patrons, of course, that you had the state, you had merchants, and they weren't necessarily hung up on religious subjects, that you could do other subjects as well. And then the third thing, humanism, a concern for and an emphasis upon human individuality, human emotion, human expression. From there you get portraits and self-portraits. Let's talk about the Italian Renaissance versus the Northern Renaissance. What are two differences? Well, we said this before. We said that the Italian Renaissance was more secular and more individual-oriented than the Northern Renaissance. The Northern Renaissance was more Christian and more concerned with improving and even, dare I say it, reforming, and that's an even more ambitious and more audacious idea, institutions and society, especially the church. The Italians were more concerned with those classical secular texts from ancient Greece and ancient Rome, whereas the Christian humanists of the North, they were more interested in classical biblical texts, Greek and Latin New Testament sources, and the writings of the early church fathers. Two similarities. What are two similarities between the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance? Both were concerned with the classics. Both had at least some regard for both individuality and society. And the value of human individuality in particular permeated both the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance, just in different ways with different results. One giant of the Italian Renaissance, well, there's so many. If you had to pick one, this one is as good as anyone else, and that's Niccolo Machiavelli. He was a Renaissance political theorist who argued in his book, The Prince, that a ruler has to deal with the realities of humanism, human nature, if he is going to be successful. And the number one reality is that it's better to be feared than to be loved. Some other highlights of his book: don't worry so much about what kind of leader you ought to be. Worry a whole lot more about what kind of leader you need to be. Because at the end of the day, your government will be judged on three things, and you might remember what they were, right? Order, security, and safety for the people. Not on how many churches you built, not on how benevolent and merciful you were. A successful prince understands the idea of virtù, and that's the determination and the ability to shape the world around you, your government, your policies, your environment, your culture, according to your will. And so we could have picked many giants of the Renaissance, but we kind of had, of the Italian Renaissance, we had to narrow it down. So there's Niccolo Machiavelli. Two giants of Christian humanism. And remember, when we say Christian humanism and Northern Renaissance are two practically synonymous terms. So how about Erasmus and Sir Thomas More? Both of these two friends were deeply concerned about bringing reform and spiritual nourishment and edification to the church and to society. And that is why Erasmus created an updated and improved New Testament. And even though this New Testament was still in Latin and Greek, it provided the scholarly foundation that later reformers were going to need if they were going to create vernacular translations of the New Testament, like Martin Luther did with German. Erasmus also showed that in reform, nothing is immune to scrutiny. Not only did Erasmus make changes to St. Jerome's original Latin translation, the Vulgate. He even went into the oldest New Testament documents available and made improvements to the original Greek language that they were in when he produced that translation. And that's a bold, daring decision, and it showed a total commitment on his part to reform. And then you have Sir Thomas More, who wrote Utopia, and that was a description of the kind of benevolent and supportive society that could exist if people just understood what living as a Christian was really all about. The impact of the printing press. There are many impacts on the printing press. It was a massive game changer. And let's just go through the list. It increased literacy in people. There was an increase in vernacular language books. There was an increase in the dissemination of ideas. Books became more affordable and therefore more available. There was a spread of scientific, Reformation, Renaissance, and Enlightenment ideas. Also, there was a consolidation and a standardization of these vernacular languages that was going to lead to an emerging sense of national commonality and national identity among the people who spoke those languages. Well, let's talk about new monarchies. There was lots that we went through. And let's begin with the last people we talked about, Ferdinand and Isabella. Their story includes so many things. Their marriage, a dynastic union of two Spanish states, Aragon and Castile, under one crown. The long, grinding Reconquista, which finally concluded with the fall of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain. The expulsion of the Jews and the expulsion of the Muslims. The financing of Christopher Columbus's voyage. The Spanish Inquisition, which was a court system instituted and controlled by the crown, and that's Ferdinand and Isabella, not the church. And this Spanish Inquisition persecuted conversos, those previously Jewish people who had converted to Christianity and had thrived, actually, in the Christian world. They had converted to Christianity sometimes generations ago, but had never gained the trust of other Christians because these Christians often resented their success and because there was an emerging racist ideology that said that Jewishness was a matter of blood and that taint never goes away. And that attitude was instituted in a government decree called the Sentencia Estatuto de Toledo. So that was just a quick summary. Charles VII, and I'm going to put here, just as a reminder, of France, just so we don't get confused. We got Charles VII of France. Now, what can we say about Charles VII of France? Aside from developing alternative sources of income by selling government offices and selling noble titles, Charles VII did a couple of significant things to consolidate his political power. And one of those was to create a permanent standing army. Before Charles VII, for many centuries, armies weren't permanent. They formed when the fighting started, and then they disbanded when the fighting ended. And in the meantime, you had these knights who were heavily armed, vicious, violent, dangerous people roaming the countryside at will, creating murder and theft and havoc. And people typically suffered more violence in times of peace than they did in times of war. Well, the permanent standing army meant that you had a steady, full-time job whether there was war or peace. And it was a professional organization. It had rank. It had a chain of command. It had uniforms. It had bases. It had steady supplies and financing. And knights now had a choice. Join the army or continue your marauding and be hunted down by this army. To get control over the church in France, Charles VII issued the Pragmatic Sanction of Bourges. And the Pragmatic Sanction of Bourges said that the French king, not the Pope, had the authority to appoint bishops and abbots in France. Popes fought the Pragmatic Sanction of Bourges for 68 years. The Pragmatic Sanction of Bourges actually leads us to Francis I of France. One big thing that Francis I did to solidify his power over the church, in addition to doing all the major things necessary to centralizing his power, the other things that we talked about, including selling noble titles and selling government offices and doing all those things, was that Francis I signed the Concordat of Bologna with the Pope. In the Concordat of Bologna, the Pope finally, after 68 years, officially recognized the French king's authority to appoint bishops and abbots in France. The French kings had taken this authority for themselves for the previous 68 years with that Pragmatic Sanction of Bourges, and the popes had been fighting it, but now, with the Concordat of Bologna, the conflict was finally resolved. The church acknowledged the French king's authority to do this, and in return got the first year's salary for all clerical appointments that the French king made. So the church was to be financially compensated now for the power it lost in France, according to this new agreement, the Concordat of Bologna. And finally, we have Henry VII of England. The unruliness and the chaotic lawlessness of English nobility was the entire reason that Henry VII became king in the first place. His early life was dominated by the War of the Roses, and that was a war of these two noble houses, the Yorks and the Lancasters, and the crown fell to Henry, who was a nephew of the last Lancaster king. This War of the Roses had basically killed the direct male bloodlines of both houses. So as king, Henry VII found a clever way to get treasonous nobles convicted and punished for their crimes against him. A noble didn't have to worry about getting convicted if he had a jury of his peers to find him innocent. So Henry VII instituted the Star Chamber, and this was a parallel court system that went by the recently Renaissance-revived Justinian law code from the old Byzantine Empire. And this system of law didn't require a jury of one's peers like the English common law did. So with the Star Chamber, Henry was able to get much more control over the nobility in England and eliminate a lot of threats to his power. And so that is really our entire review for this test. If you know these things and know them well, I anticipate you'll do really well on this test. So good luck, and we'll see you then.